The Parisi Palace, high above 3773 East Broadway. This is the Jake Feinberg Show. Coming to you on Power Talk. Please go to our website, powertalk.live. Download our free app and stream all of our live local programming, including Solomon on Blast, the Jim Parisi Show, and yours truly, the Jake Feinberg Show. Can't thank you enough for making us part of your day today. And as I continue along, my guest and I, we had a cosmic first interview last week talking about her life as the spouse of a historic musical figure, Stan Getz, somebody who was a genius and also an addict, and somebody that is absolutely needs to be focused on more in our society and our culture, because both those things, genius and addiction, are paramount, and many people are dealing with it. Monica Getz, welcome back to the Jake Feinberg Show.
Thank you. My pleasure.
You know, this is something that was in my head. I kind of wanted you to talk to the audience about when you guys moved back to Sweden. From what I can gather, you were living in a castle of some sort, and or just some sort of big house. And could you talk about the cats who used to come over for the parties? Was it who used to come in there? What was that scene like there?
Okay. First of all, it's what you assume there is a mix-up of many things.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, it wasn't Sweden that we lived in. We lived in Denmark, actually.
Thank you. I'm always confusing it. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and we lived in in two different main places. One, at first when we arrived, my mother, who is just brilliant at finding these places, found a wonderful, charming house that belonged to the property belonged to the Danish king, but it was a charming, unassuming, beautiful house that had been lovingly restored by the head of architecture at the Danish Royal School of Architecture, himself a brilliant man, and it was just perfect for us. We rented it furnished. It had a little private lake with swans on it. Not pretentious at all, just wonderful. It was called Prinsessestien, which means the little path of the princesses, number 9, in Kongens Lyngby in Denmark. And everybody visited us there. And when people say parties today, and if you mention addiction, they think, oh, wow, raving. No. Very quiet, sweet situation. Stan was mostly sober. He certainly could not get drugs at all, which was one of the reasons that I decided to stay with much persuasion from our family in Sweden. We originally were living in a castle at one time, but that's a separate story. That's my life before I met Stan. Stan and I lived in this charming place, and then eventually we moved to a place in Elsinore, right next to also an unpretentious house, but right by the ocean. Stan loved the ocean. And right next to Elsinore Castle, where Hamlet always is performed. And so those were the two places we lived. And both of those places in Denmark spelled out peace. Interestingly enough, I think this Professor Fisker, his son, is now well known for designing these cars that sort of are like Teslas, way ahead of their time.
Are they Teslas, or they're different from Teslas?
No, they're different from Teslas. Fisker, they were called the Fisker cars. I haven't heard of them lately, but when I mentioned to my son that I think there might be a relationship there between the owner of our house that we rented in Denmark, and this designer, he said, "Oh, Mom, you think everybody's related, but it turns out it is a smaller world, and it turns out that yes, they were related."
Of course, we are all connected in some way. You know what it is?
And we are.
We are. But here's the thing, because you helped Stan when he cut the now famous Girl from Ipanema. You helped him get that onto many different platforms.
That was much later.
I know, but no, this is my question,
yeah.
though. My question is, at that time, was Stan, objectively, what was his, how was he recognized? Was he a star at that point? He was not an international star at that point, or was he, or in Europe, they looked at him, how was he treated as a musician there, and what was his status at that point?
You know, we've moved on from something that you asked the question, and I guess I'm so conscientious about answering you specifically about houses and things. I never got to mention the musicians that you asked about.
Yeah, no, that's what I really wanted to know about. I want to know about those parties because, I mean, I know that they were not raves.
Don't call them parties. Maybe you can call them get-togethers, but they weren't parties. They were a constant stream of musicians. You see, Stan wanted something to do, and his life revolves around music. So I contacted a small club called Montmartre. That was just a little hole in the wall, and we got to be good friends with the owners of that club, a wife and a husband, and Stan brought. And myself, Mose Allison, Oscar Pettiford, an endless stream of American musicians through our house. And I remember specifically one barbecue. I wouldn't call it parties because that implies other things today, but one barbecue, old-fashioned family barbecue that we had.
I love it.
Where Ella Fitzgerald put on an apron.
Wow.
And Louis Armstrong fought with her about who was going to do the grilling. And I think Oscar was there, Herb Ellis, Ray Brown, and many other musicians came from time to time. And that one particular time was so unforgettable. They started singing, Ella and Louis, and I think that was the first time before they made any records together or anything. And they sang all night. And everybody picked up their instruments. It was just one of the most unforgettable evenings in my life.
Wow, you are now you're waxing poetic, as they say. That is an amazing situation. You're telling me that so you had, I mean, Stan was I knew he was deeply connected to Dizzy and Sonny Stitt and Miles, but I mean the original masters like Louis and Stan were Louis and Stan had
very close. You know, Louis was extraordinary person. He talked his own language, sort of like Lester did. And Stan was able to communicate because Stan was a man, in the beginning when I first knew him, a man of very few words. He really, I wouldn't say he was inarticulate, but he was very shy about his opinions. Later, not so much so. But I think I helped him feel secure.
You did.
Enough to express himself. But in those days, it isn't an easy answer to your question, because in those days, all these people were not recognized the way they should have been in the United States. Of course they weren't. They were relatively unknown. Jazz musicians, it had its own audience, very select, classy audience, but its own audience. It had nothing to do with Elvis Presley and popular music.
Absolutely.
But in Sweden and Denmark and Paris and London, they became gradually musical royalty. And I think it had to do a lot with the fact that um, Sweden wasn't held back by black and white prejudices. It wasn't held back. They were able to just listen to the quality of the music. They were always searching for something better. And I think your question about the people that passed through our house, in those days, Jazz at the Philharmonic, for instance, they had all this really incredible talent, really wasting it. Um, eh, but the Scandinavians and the Europeans ate it up, loved it. And that little place, Montmartre, I think still exists today. It was legendary. And money was never a factor. Never, ever the main factor. It was getting together and playing. They were paid, the musicians, but no one in Sweden was making all that much money, or Denmark in those days. And no drugs, no street drugs. Can you believe it? It wasn't until the Rolling Stones came in the 70s that drugs just all of a sudden flooded Denmark mainly, but eventually Sweden too.
This is something I wanted to, as Stan's wife, I wanted. There's a story that I read of him. Basically, like you said, he was not articulate. He was a genius. When you first met him, he was not an overly expressive person, and like most guys, had a hard time expressing their emotions. And he would sometimes, for whatever reason, he would drink a lot, and it still wouldn't take the edge off. And he actually wound up in your house. He destroyed the house. He smashed the whole house apart.
Well,
can you talk about that time in your own?
Yes, yes, I can. I can, because what really happened was, and now alcoholism, chemical dependency now became my field eventually.
Absolutely, that's why I want you to talk about it.
And so it's not generally understood really what addiction is. But Stan was mostly sober because, for one thing, I wouldn't have it any other way in my house. So it was only on the road really that basically he would drink. He became, once he relapsed for the first time after he had been scared straight about what had happened to him with going to jail and all of that. He was sober for quite a while. Once he started to relapse, which most people don't understand, that alcohol and drugs, the brain does not tell the difference. So if many people think it's okay to smoke pot, but not for people who are predisposed towards addiction. And there is a gene there, and I didn't understand that either, of course, but I eventually found out that Stan's grandfather killed his grandmother with an ice pick. She died eventually of the wounds. She didn't die right away. But I met him later in life, and Stan's aunt, where he was living, never forgave him, never spoke to him, but because the doctors had told him that he shouldn't drink anymore, he was another person, a gentle little old Russian man shuffling about with such interesting stories and highly intelligent, so that these people are actually two different people. The ones that are under the influence, you often become either violent or fall asleep, and it's progressive. It always gets worse, never gets better. Except for one thing, certain people are eventually able to become periodic. That means that they can drink for a period of time and they can stop. They can't ever stay stopped unless they go to a 12-step program or a rehab that's usually based on a 12-step program. But they have to maintain that understanding that this is a chronic condition. It's just arrested periodically. So what happened was that most of us in the family never saw Stan as destructive as he would become when he was drinking. Also, he would become the same way from certain medications. Like in those days, jazz musicians didn't understand, or no one understood, that took, for instance, sleeping pills, certain classes of sleeping pills called barbiturates. They would take Tuinal, Seconal, these kinds of things. And Stan had a paradoxical reaction to those medications. So when he took that, instead of going to sleep, he became more and more agitated. This is how Marilyn Monroe died. She took these sleeping pills that were on her bedside, and she'd forgotten that she'd taken them because they also have that effect. And then she would mix it with alcohol, and then gradually her lungs ceased to work. That's how these people die from overdoses. It has a synergistic effect. 2 plus 2 doesn't become 4 anymore. It becomes 22.
I understand.
The effect of it. And so with Stan, most of these periods when he produced these records post that experience in Sweden, he was able to stay sober for long periods of time. But when he relapsed and when he started to drink, it was as if the alcoholism had never stopped. He was that much further down on the progression, so that his symptoms became so much worse. And that's what happened to Coltrane, for instance. He didn't drink or take any drugs for long, long periods of time. And then, unfortunately, he had a relapse. And having a memory about how much he needed to feel that high took much too much, and his body couldn't handle it. And so usually the vena cava, which is a vein in the stomach, bursts from that onslaught of drugs and or alcohol, and they bleed to death internally. But I do want to say something about Coltrane while we're on the subject, because we usually take up a subject.
No, I just love where you go with you go wherever you want. But yeah, any story about training.
Coltrane.
Any story about training is good.
Before we forget,
yeah, right.
Because Coltrane was one of the ones who came in and out of our home, wherever we were, and I was on a Jazz at the Philharmonic tour because I know you're interested by listening to your other radio interviews in discrimination and those kinds of things.
Absolutely.
Well, we experienced something that was reverse discrimination, which was there was a movement in Europe where, and I guess maybe it was in America too, but I wasn't aware of it, where the students of the jazz art, so to speak, the typical German young reporter that this actually I happened to witness interview John, was determined to get him to say that white players can't play and black players are the only ones that can play. That was like a movement in Germany at that time.
Wow.
And he was determined, and he followed John around, and John shared this with me a couple of times, that he felt uncomfortable about this kid. So one morning, I'm sitting in a hotel. We were all staying in the same hotel then at the Jazz at the Philharmonic, and in the cafeteria having breakfast. And there, sure enough, was that kid interviewing John. And they both sat with their backs towards me, so I could hear them perfectly, but they couldn't see me. So I hear this kid asking John over and over again to try to put Stan down in some way. And then finally I heard John exasperatedly say, "Kid, we would all play like Stan if we could." And that really shut the kid up. And I couldn't believe how sweet that was of John to say that.
That's a legendary quote. That's been told over and over again, and that was the.
I heard it. I might not have believed it if I hadn't heard it with my own ears.
You heard it with your own ears.
Yeah, and there were people around me who heard it too, and afterwards, I just went up and gave him a big hug, and he says, "Oh, were you here too?"
Talking to Monica Getz here again, just having a ball. I wanted to read this quote and this story, and then I want you to just talk about it as a spouse and how you dealt with it with your children, because this is real life, and we all are dealing in our own sort of family dynamics, and
it's so prevalent. It's so prevalent.
So here, I'm going to read this to you, and then I want you to you don't need to talk about Stan. I want you to talk about how you specifically, as a spouse of somebody who was dealing with addiction, how you dealt with it. He said, okay, this is when you were in Denmark. After dinner, Stan felt overwhelmed by a mixture of sadness and rage. Trying to dull it with scotch, he wound up going outside, found a pile of bricks, and threw them one by one through the window. He came inside, grabbed a poker from the fireplace, and smashed all the plates in a collection of renowned Royal Copenhagen china. How did Monica Getz, at that time, before you became an advocate that you are today, can you talk to people, how did you deal with that?
I'd forgotten about that, but that's exactly what happened.
Okay. I'm sorry to. I mean, I don't mean to bring it. This is where the rubber meets the road. Yeah.
This is my job to talk about these things.
That's right.
I love to talk about it because there's so much ignorance today surrounding this.
I agree.
Well, that was a very important evening, actually, because it was much worse than you described. Stan had been fine. Stan's both parents were visiting us from America, so he had all the motivation in the world to try to modify any of his behaviors. But it's a perfect example of the shock that the family experiences when you think finally he's on his way, he's healthy, he's playing, everything is going well, and some little thing happens and they get into their heads, it's called denial, that, oh, I can drink like everybody else, just one, And it's usually it was celebratory for Stan. So many people think, oh, the pressures of working in jazz clubs and all that. No. He got it in his head that he was going to celebrate that he had been sober so long. And here was his mother, his father, my mother was there, who is a brilliant child psychologist and a brilliant person all together, who didn't know much about alcoholism either, because psychologists and psychiatrists to this day, if they haven't gone recently to a medical school that teaches this, are in the Stone Ages about this. So that night, this all happened, and it doesn't say that the bricks that he threw through the closed windows was into the nursery, where we had rushed immediately when we realized that Stan was completely out of control. Stan's mother, father, my mother, and myself, we took the children and hid them under beds and in closets because these bricks were flying in through the window. They could have killed somebody. And then my brave mother, who during the war went into the raging war to get people out of concentration camps, she said, I have the number to a doctor nearby. I'm going to call him because this cannot go on. And so she called him, and he was the inventor of antabuse. I don't know if you've ever heard of antabuse, but
we're gonna spend a full segment on antabuse. So
okay.
All right, but I want you to. This is about Monica Getz before major advocacy became part of your life, as to how you dealt with this individual who was who didn't have he was celebrating, but then it went too far.
So he couldn't stop because he had that gene in him, and he couldn't stop. It's like somebody going down a slope, and all of a sudden the brakes are not working. Accelerated.
Right.
And his mind shorted out. And certain brains, depending usually on your genetic origins, he came from that wild Russia, and Mongols and going berserk come from that thing that happens when people drink too much and they have the wrong genes. He went berserk. So different than the kind of quiet, peaceful person that he wanted to be. The alcohol took control of his frontal cortex, which is the area of the brain. I didn't know this then, but I know now, the area of the brain that has all the civil behavior is the frontal cortex. What takes over is the primitive brain, and that is like a reptile. It's called a reptile brain, and it's the primitive brain, and you can just see how people in the olden age used to think how people became obsessed by the devil or something, because they used all their intelligence, all their sensitivity, all their civilized behavior goes out the door, and they become basically like reptiles. They look the same. They don't look like bums, but their behavior becomes very cunning, very manipulative, and finally also very violent. But not all people. Just the Finns that are also related to the native populations of certain areas of the world have more of this violent behavior. The American Indian, who has not been exposed to alcohol, often get that instant violent behavior. Oscar Pettiford, for instance, had that same instantly, no, I wouldn't say instantly, but during the same night, you can look at your watch and see how they progress into that area of the brain and become more and more evil, more and more violent, and it's time to go home, if not time to hide,
Absolutely.
So I was completely at a loss. My smart mother called her friend in the middle of the night, Dr. Martinson Larson was his name. You can Google him. He was a brilliant scientist, and he had discovered accidentally that when certain workers in a factory were working, I think they were making rubber in that factory, there was a certain substance that made them not be able to drink. They used to get an allergic reaction if they even drank a beer or not much alcohol, which is very common in Denmark. They become slightly ill, like an allergic reaction. And so he developed this antabuse, which is, the name means anti-abuse, and he thought that he had solved the alcoholism problem in the world, because all people have to do now is to take a pill. He was also a psychiatrist, and he came that night. The police came with 2 big Schaefer dogs, and the minute that Stan saw the dogs and the police, he calmed down. It was like he hoped that somebody would try to stop him. And he went in the car with Dr. Martinson Larson, who was fascinated by Stan. They talked all night, and Stan decided to start taking antabuse himself. And so he was sober for a long time. But there's only one flaw with the antabuse, 2 flaws really, now that I know about the beautiful 12-step program, which is sort of a maturity process that every addict needs to stay sober. But I didn't know anything about that then. The other flaw with antabuse is that when the person themselves feel the urge, of course they stop taking the pill. So there is really very little control also over that. So eventually, there was a Japanese study that showed that if wives gave, or significant others gave it routinely every day, and the patient had agreed that that was okay, the longevity of the sobriety would vastly increase, because it wouldn't be a macho thing that I'm now taking a pill to stay sober. I can stay sober. Subconsciously, the sobriety lasted longer. But at that time, how I reacted just like any other normal person would react. We just hid, and we try to protect the children, and we try to get Stan a doctor because we knew this wasn't normal behavior. But I can't say my mother, as respected as she was as a psychologist, had any more knowledge than I did. But at least she did the sensible thing.
Well, I mean, it's traumatic. I mean, you had five.
No, I didn't have 5 then. This happened. I can tell you exactly when this happened. I had just had Pamela, so that would have been 58, 59 probably. And so the last 5th child was 62. But I had my hands full. And after that summer, I determined to go to medical school to learn everything I could about alcoholism, because this I knew was not acceptable. We could not, as much as we loved each other and as much as we really was the love story of the century, no one can live with an active addict and be happy. If you think of the children, they shouldn't see and hear some of these things that go on, because it's like living with the devil, sleeping with the enemy is really what this is about, if you don't do something about it. So I went to medical school in Denmark and it was hard for me because I had studied languages and right brain stuff all my life, so I had to go back, learn chemistry, physics, even to get in. It was very hard to get into Danish medical school. I think they had 200 applicants and they took 48,
Wow.
And I was so lucky to get in. But wouldn't you know it, Stan hated that I went to medical school, because I think every addict wants a person that they can depend on to defend them and to protect them from their own actions and all of that. So he hid the car keys, did everything he could. But I persisted until I learned that in medical school at that time, never mind Denmark or Sweden or America, you learn just useless things about addiction. As a matter of fact, contradictory things that they really just dealt with that 2% of alcoholics that are really non-functional. By the time they're so sick, they're really on their way to death, the ones that we dealt with in medical school. And it isn't at all helpful. That's much too late. You have to get in there and try to prevent the progression of the disease early. And they didn't understand that these are normal people like you and me, just with a different constellation of genes. And that anybody can really recover if you immerse yourself in the 12-step program. You become a better person and a more mature person than the average person. But I didn't know anything about that then. All I knew was that this could not continue with the children and our own physical safety. So
how did you? This is.
But the antabuse helped at the time. So
no, I want to. This is also. I just want to go back.
And,
and you are speaking with great candor. I mean.
Well, that's what I do.
No, I wanted. First of all, I'm reading. I'm quoting this thing here. Stan, let me read this here.
What are you reading from? I'm interested because it is accurate.
Yeah, no, this is the Donald Magan book.
Oh, well, that's a lot of stuff that was not accurate in there.
Okay, but and you can correct that. But what I'm saying, I want to go. This is where I get. It says. Just to go back to the beginning, and again, I'm going to use that 5-letter word that you can use what you want. This is what it said in there. Stan and Monica were the jazz ambassadors in Copenhagen. Whenever American musicians were around, it was a party at the Getz house in Elsinore. Now, we're not going to say party, but you, Monica, were an ambassador. You always have been an ambassador.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this to me is one of the most electric times because... what I want you to talk about is self-preservation for the spouse. I mean, your life, he would become, he wouldn't even know what he was doing, and he would almost kill you.
Yeah, true.
And the question is not why did you stay with him. The question is how did you self-preserve? How did you save yourself? Because most people, I mean, some of these stories, are.
Well, first of all, I know now in retrospect that, talk about genes, I came from two families of extraordinary strength and stability. My mother and my father both. My mother on her mother's side and my father on his father's side had extraordinary, wonderful, compassionate lives that can only be illustrated. Let me see who would Americans know. Raoul Wallenberg were their childhood friends. Do you know anything about Raoul Wallenberg?
No,
Saved thousands of Jews in Hungary during the war. Very brave. My grandfather, my mother's side, and his father were pioneers. Abe Lincoln asked him to come over here to build the what's the name, Monitor. Just my grandfather himself walked from the southern tip of Africa to the northern tip in 1905, absolutely fearless, because we've all had larger perspective of life than just save your own skin kind of thing. My mother and father both went in, no, my mother only actually, although my father was brave too. My father went into Spain during the terrible time of Guernica and the destruction of the Spanish people by the Nazi airplanes that were attacking, building a neutral hospital as the bullets were flying in the middle of Spain. My mother went into Germany in the middle of the war, 1942 or 43, and got people out of concentration camps. I come from a fairly fearless family, and with things that I didn't reflect over at the time, but I always wanted to do good and kind and life-changing things for people. I had such a secure childhood. I think that comes down to that. My psyche was never damaged by Stan. I always knew it wasn't my fault.
Right.
This is a 12-step phrase, It wasn't my fault. I can't cure it probably, but at least I can do my part. And finally, the turning point in my life of understanding this disease came not from going to medical school, because everything at that time that was taught in medical school was useless, but by hearing about Minnesota and how Minnesota was about 40 years ahead of its time, and particularly one place that originated all rehabs in the country that are worth anything today, and that's Hazelden, which takes us back to Bill Wilson, who interestingly, pretty much contemporary with my own birth, experienced alcoholism in himself and started AA, and then his wife, Bill Wilson's wife, Lois, eventually became my sponsor in Al-Anon. So she created Al-Anon for family members, which is teaching family members the to do and not to do in order to be successful in having a normal, healthy life for both parties and for the children. And that was totally opposite of what anybody had ever told me before on how to behave and what to do. It's perfectly possible to live with an alcoholic as long as he's addressing his problem. And the good things about Stan was that he always really wanted to be sober. He always had the memory of that time in Sweden when he was clean and sober for a short period of time, and he felt like he played like a god, and he was in contact with God.
Well, this is that's going to need to be explored. You were going to have Ella Fitzgerald sing at your wedding, but then
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm so surprised that that's in Megan's book. Yeah, yeah. We were going to have a big wedding, basically with the people I mentioned. You know, the people that were really close to us, and
When you say
with
that
music
you
to
were
them.
gonna the cats you were close to in Denmark.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So
But
they were
that,
going to play.
but
Yeah.
I mean that you would say definitively that from the time that you saw Stan get the standing ovation because it was the first time that he played since coming out of jail, and
Well, it was one of the first times. I think he had played at the Shrine first. There was some recordings from that, but he
what I'm
eventually.
saying is like, but I
Mm.
mean you had to cancel that idea because Bev was you had to go back and get the kids.
Yeah, yeah. That what happened was that the children needed us, and we couldn't have that second stately wedding that we were going to have, and it probably would have been lots of fun too with all those musicians. Um, but that wasn't even to think about because the kids came first.
Um, God, just having such a. Tell me about Stan's. This talk about. I want to just get a few things clear. Um, Goldie had super. I mean, in order to escape the ghettos of as a Jewish gypsy from the ghettos of the Bronx, you had to be beyond perfect. Did perfection play a role in Stan's? If things were not perfect in his mind, is that when the rage began? When I mean, I know he was an
No, no.
psychologically.
I really I used to believe all kinds of theories like that, but now, knowing what I do know and what I have learned, is that it is just an area of the brain genetically where the mind goes. It is some kind of a primitive violence, um, where I think the brain itself feels threatened. And if you can think of all primitive people, when there was aggression, attack was the best defense. So that paranoia is part of that picture of violence. They are deluded and they feel that everybody's attacking them, and so they're going to attack first, kind of thing. It is very, very interesting, but it's not suppressed rage from childhood or anything like that.
Well, let me ask you a question though, because
It's a knee-jerk reaction to the chemical, and it's so interesting because certain chemicals can predictably produce certain behaviors in rats who certainly, at least as far as I know, can't remember their childhood and have carry rages.
you know but I do think that there's a factor of Stan, not just the fact that in ninth grade he was on the road with Tea Garden's band, and those guys would say to him, "Hey, that woman has syphilis, and you're going to sleep with her tonight." They
I
torture.
don't believe it. I don't believe that for a minute. That's a myth. That is, Stan and I talked about everything. This is the first time I heard this. I don't believe it.
You don't think that? Do you think that being on the road 364 days a year, traveling relentlessly, obviously, I mean, the truant officer came to get him.
Yeah,
And
and well, he should have.
exactly, but you know what? He didn't go. And what I'm saying is he was the youngest cat there, and we all know in these fraternal bands and things like that, did he get exposed to stuff? I mean, there was a psychological component to it. I'd like you to talk. I'd like you to just talk about the psychology of Stan, even when he was sober. What was his psychological state about? Because yeah, he was never diagnosed, and I don't think you would think that. I don't think he was manic depressive, but there was a psychological component to it, and I'm wondering if his exposure to the road.
Let me put your mind to rest. Okay.
Thank you.
First of all, before I understood what alcoholism was, my family things medically. So they suggested psychiatrists. I have a cousin who is probably the most prominent psychiatrist. He's dead now in Sweden. Everybody thought in terms of psychiatrists. So poor Stan went to psychiatrist after psychiatrist. You can imagine what that just cost. But he loved talking about himself, and at the end, we were so much poorer, and he was none the wiser, nor was I, and it was endless. And he was drinking and going drunk to psychiatrists. It didn't seem to make one iota worth of difference. And the cumulative answer at the end of, finally they got tired of him, and they would say to me, Monica, there's nothing wrong with him except he drinks too much or he takes drugs. And he's a nice Jewish boy from the Bronx with very caring parents, but they couldn't figure it out. So now that I know what I know, we know from almost every rehab in the country that psychiatrists never helped anybody unless they themselves have gone to a rehab and learned from the people who treat people in rehab. But AA is really the only lasting revolutionary. Aldous Huxley called Bill Wilson and the AA movement, the 12-step program, the most revolutionary social movement of that century.
Get out of here.
No.
Did you know him? Did you know Albert Huxley?
No, I didn't, but I know people who knew him.
Did you guys spend time with Timothy Leary?
No. But Timothy Leary was a typical product of that era.
Exactly.
And luckily,
exactly.
luckily, Stan didn't hang out with him.
Monica, it is such a treat to talk to you. You are in such amazing you're so sharp. The track we let in with was called My Buddy, and that was a collaboration he did with Cal Jader. Did you know Cal?
No, I didn't know Cal, but I did know that song. Stan loved that song, and he did. He made. I'm trying to think of the piano player now. He made an album called Peacocks.
Yeah, no, Jimmy Rolls.
Jimmy Rolls, and they played that so beautifully, My Buddy, and they were really buddies.
I mean, I just want to say, I'm going to send you this later because I've done.
But I like Cal Chater. I really do. I don't know him personally. I think that sounds to me, Chater is a certain kind of bird in Sweden. I think he might have been
Oh, you're 100% correct. He's from Swedish descent, grew up in St. Louis, and turned into one of the greatest Latin jazz vibraphonists in the world. Go figure. But,
go figure. Yeah. And Stan always had an attraction to the Latin, all of it. Latin beat, Latin harmony.
Listen, we haven't even touched the surface here. He was a
natural.
I've interviewed Stanley Clarke 3 times. Tony's gone, but he was cranking through those Spanish Brazilian bossa tunes with Chick Corea all through this. That's more bossa, but the Afro-Cuban stuff is beautiful too. It's Billy Higgins and Scott LaFaro.
Loved it.
Did as we end here in the late 50s, I just want you to be honest here. He obviously was super tight with Train and Miles, but Stan was a competitor, and he was winning downbeat awards, but.
Oh, that's a whole other.
No, I wanted to, but I want. This is my question. Okay, this is important. Is that it is it's written that in the late he was getting anxious because Train and Miles were starting this new movement in jazz in the West, and he was getting anxious. He was with Pettiford. He was doing his thing, and he was desperate to get back to America, and you guys moved back, and I'm not sure exactly where you moved first, but was that the impetus to move back? Is that he felt like he wanted to get back on home ground to start doing stuff that was in his head?
Yes and no. Let me tell you exactly.
Exactly, yeah.
about that. Um, we have lived all over the world. We lived in Spain for a while. We've lived in many, many places because he was always searching for peace, really. And peace and New York City sort of don't go together. However,
I completely agree. That's why I don't live in there. I don't live in the East Coast anymore.
however, he was always also yearning for that cauldron feeling of when everybody spark off one another. And let's face it, as much as New York is not a peaceful spot to be or to live, this is where it's happening, and especially in those days. But I think even now, I think New York is a cauldron of energy and spark, and certainly
And
New York
a
City.
lot of tension too. A lot of tension.
Yeah, but I think he wasn't looking for tension. Stan was looking for just great music always.
Well, and the best music, as you know, and I don't need to tell you, there's tension and release. So go ahead.
Exactly, exactly. So that's where he was conflicted, and so that's where we would live someplace, and then one morning he'd wake up, and he said, "I need to go to New York." And I really feared New York so much because that's really where also addiction is happening, and we managed to have a quite a lovely, quiet life in Denmark. He was earning decent money. He got his self-esteem back. He was drug-free. He did have episodes with alcohol, but it was mostly just alcohol. So when he announced that he felt that we should abandon all the stuff that we had built up, our network there, and the club where he could play when he wanted to, and the nice school for the children and all of that. It was really a big decision. But if I can say that for myself, my commitment was really to Stan, and I knew that, and his children, and I knew he would never really be happy in a small town in Denmark.
Well, I cannot wait. I mean, we are. This is where the rubber meets the road, because I know when he came back that they were saying, producers were saying, well, how do we regain his popularity and his footing here in the States? And they were saying, just do some pop stuff, Stan. Just do some commercial stuff to get your name back out there. And he said, no. And we're gonna. It was focused.
It was I who actually said to him, "There's only one condition that I'm going back to the States, and that is that you work with the best musicians you can find, and that you really do what you say you're going to do, which is not just waste your time getting high and doing all the stuff that he could have done, but really do the music that's in your heart." And we discussed that way before. We were very aware of what was going on in America at that time. We were very aware that these long solos and what was called hate music and all of that was going on.
You are nailing. I am so. This is so great. There was this. I'm telling you, those liner notes. It was like Archie Shepp and John Coltrane. That was angry. Again, it was totally false. Unfortunately, white journalists like myself were probably dubbing it this like angry message music. It was the farthest thing from it.
Yeah.
But we are going to. Can we do? Can we do set 3? Maybe
sure.
Next week. I
Sure.
also. I need to.
I feel we're just